Hi! So if you follow me on Instagram, then you may or may not have seen a recent post that I just did announcing a new project that I'm to be working on for the next couple of months. Well, 1 month really. There's this one portrait in the Washington National Gallery down in Washington, D.C. in which the subject just so happens to look nearly exactly like my sister. This has been a running joke for many years, and so we just thought how fun it would be if I were to reconstruct the dress in historical practice for her to wear, and then we can go to the museum and see the two of them side by side in the same dress. The portrait is from 1798, I believe. It's called Portrait of a Young Woman in White, and I will put a picture of the side-by-side post somewhere on the screen so that you too can revel in the extraordinary likeness. And so my task now is to get started on reconstructing the dress. I have spent many an hour poring over this portrait, trying to figure out what is going on with this dress, how it works, and possibly how it could have been constructed. And here's what I think is the solution. Now, I could be very wrong. This is just entirely my interpretation of what's happening, as obviously nobody is alive to ask anymore, and the dress isn't an extant garment that we can photograph and examine from a museum collection or private collection. So 1798 would have been part of the early Regency period. They were very heavily influenced by classical Greek and Roman statuary, and this was reflected in their styles of dress, in very long and slim, light, both in material weight and in color, gowns that the ladies were wearing, and the woman in the portrait is a perfect representation of that style. From what we understand, the women in this period would have been wearing several layers of clothing. They would have had a shift, an undershirt layer. They would have then possibly been wearing stays, although that point is debated both in modern scholarship as well as in the contemporary texts. I have found references to both the wearing of the stays and not wearing stays within this period. She would then be wearing a petticoat layer, and then finally the overdress and whatever else further that involved, whether it was a jacket or a shawl or outerwear of any sort. But we are stopping at the gown because that's what the portrait dictates. However, I have a different theory about the gown in the painting. Clearly she is not wearing a shift, because you would see the sleeves of it. It would not be sheer, because the shifts had to have been made from very durable linens that had to be washed regularly. So they would not have been made from very lightweight cottons, as you see on the sleeve of the gown in the portrait. So that is the sleeve of her overgown, I'm quite sure, which means she possibly is not wearing a shift. I am also of the belief that she is not wearing stays, only because I feel like with the level that the gown is cut in the portrait, you would see the top of the stays. Also, I think her bust is sitting a little bit too low for that classic Regency lift and separate effect that was so the fashion. So without the shift in the stays, it is my theory that the woman in the portrait is only wearing her petticoat and her overgown. The petticoat, of course, providing the opacity of the gown, and the overgown just being completely sheer. And whether or not she did this in real life, whether or not she walked around without her shift and her stays in real life, which I don't think she did, I think this was just a sort of design choice for the style of the portrait, in that the desired effect of the portrait was to depict a very classical Greek sort of ethereal figure, free from the obvious signals of very modern day fashions, which would have been given away by the presence of the stays. So obviously the woman in the portrait has taken a little bit of liberty with the styling of her clothing. She has cut the opaque layer of the gown well under her bust, which is something that I think we're going to try and not do for our purposes, only because we have to appear in public with this gown, potentially in a museum setting, and my sister probably won't be up for public nudity. I have another theory as to how we could do this, and of course this is probably something that will be proven or disproven once we actually have the garments and can play with them in 3 dimensions instead of just in my brain. But what I think can happen is that I've been doing some research on petticoats. Backing up for a second, so petticoats in the Regency period are a little bit different from what we tend to think a petticoat looks like today, in that because the fashionable waistline sat just under the bust, there's really no way for a garment to sit there comfortably without sliding down. Therefore, the petticoats of this period tended to either have sort of suspender-like straps or a full bodice attached to the skirt. That way they could suspend from the shoulders instead of just sort of precariously trying to sit in the middle of your ribcage. I think we are seeing evidence of a bodiced petticoat in the portrait, in that it sort of is trying to come up over her bust, and so this is what I'm going to be starting with today. Now, I have been doing some research on these bodiced petticoats. There are a couple of great extant examples photographed and online from some museums that I've been referencing, and the majority of them have a drawstring gather at the neckline, some of them tying at center front, so that they could potentially be loosened, I think. So it is my theory that the woman in the portrait might possibly have taken the neckline of her bodiced petticoat, loosened it, and just pulled it down so that it doesn't interfere with that nice little V-shaped neckline that she's got going on with the overgown. This could just be wild conjecture, but I think that is what I'm going to start off with in this great investigation. So without further ado, we shall go ahead and get started on the experimental making process for this petticoat today. This will be a sort of part 1 to this video series, I suppose. Part 2, of course, will be the making of the actual overgown and the big final reveal, whatever that is. So let's get started. So starting things off a little bit differently today, I'm actually just going to explain to you where I am in the process because I have already begun it. I'm not actually making this petticoat thing for me, so I was a little bit pressed for time in getting things together for the mock-up to fit while I had her available. So here's where I am right now. I have made an initial pattern, I have done a mock-up, and then I have made some edits to the pattern. I have cut out the bodice and started to stitch it together, so more footage to resume shortly, but I'll just take a minute to explain how I got to where I am right now. Firstly, I have 2 reference images that I pulled from. This is from MFA Boston, and this one is from the Metropolitan Museum here in New York. These are the 2 petticoat images that have most intrigued me in regards to the reference portrait that I'm working from, and so these are the ones that I'm using to reference for my project. This one I'm interested in mainly because of the bodice. I think the shape of the bodice is closest to what's visible in the portrait. This bodice is a little bit longer, which I think will interfere with the delicate neckline of the original gown. However, the back of it is what I'm really interested in because we actually don't get a back image of this one here. So this is the one that I'm using for my back reference. And what's really interesting to me here is that the arm's eye is cut really, really far in, just like the way that 18th century gowns were cut like. And I know by the Regency period, a lot of the arm's eyes tend to start being cut more towards the edge of the shoulder, but this was actually really interesting to me just story-wise because it would make sense that the petticoat could be homemade based on old patterns that someone's got laying around, or since this is an undergarment that doesn't have to be seen and doesn't necessarily have to be fashionable, it could just be continually cut the same traditional way that someone's been making their petticoats for years and years and years. So I just thought this one had a really nice story to it, and I really wanted to try and replicate this. And so in order to do that, I have consulted my trusty Janet Arnold. I have found some gowns in here where the shapes of the bodice patterns actually do sort of imitate the references that I have pulled, and so I'm looking at the shapes of the patterns to see if I can just use some of the geometry that she's kindly already provided for me here so that I don't have to try and figure out how to draft this myself, because I don't think I'm quite that knowledgeable in Regency to be able to do that. So this was a little bit of a Frankenstein process, and I shall show you how I did it. Hopefully it will all turn out and it won't be too horribly pieced together, but here's what I'm attempting, is that this gown over here actually has what I think the bodice shape should look like that I'm going for. Whereas this one over here, the arm's eye is cut quite close to the shoulder. This one here, it's cut a little bit farther into the back, and so I think this is the one that I'm going to try and go to. I will probably have to extend it a little bit, only because I'm not trying to create this little bustle shape back here. That would just interfere with the dress, and this bodice does curve up slightly at the back to allow for that, and I don't really want that, so that will probably have to be extended a bit, but these are the shapes that I think I'm going to be going for. So here's the center back piece that I'm looking at, and this I've actually just traced directly off. However, the front of this dress doesn't actually do what I would like it to do. This one, however, does actually look sort of similar to the petticoats that I was referencing. So what I actually did is I took one half of the center back piece, and then I traced off this bodice piece from the other dress, which actually also has this little side piece. I got rid of the side seam and just traced it all together since this is just one straight seam here, and I didn't think that was really necessary to split into 2. And then since this curve here has to fit into this curve here, I just traced off this shape while drawing this here so that it would fit together nicely. So here's the little scale piece that I came up with, and I did this by just taking a plain piece of paper and laying it over the piece that I wanted to trace. So I actually started over here, laid it over this, traced it off, and then when I wanted to draw this curve, I took that over here, laid it over this, and then just traced off this curve on the edge of this. And then I believe I made, yes, I did make some changes to the shoulder strap, because the strap in this gown actually curves up and it's one piece, whereas this one has a separate strap that connects to it sort of at an angle. And so when I got to this point, I just took my little drawing, back over to here, and I traced off this little curved shape of this piece and attached it onto here. And then I ended up with this, and this is actually now a scale Janet Arnold style pattern piece that I could then scale up to get the shape that I wanted to cut out for my mock-up. And so this is the mock-up that I ended up with. This is actually post-fitting, so it has been altered a bit. I've got my waistband here, and then I've got my bodice shape here, and it connects to the center back piece here. And then there were just some basic fit issues. And so on this side, you can actually see this is where I started measuring to how long I needed to extend to the back of this bodice, and pinned in a bit of muslin so that I could see how long it is. After the fitting, I traced off the pieces, added them to my original scaled up pattern, and then I ended up with something like this, which I'm not entirely sure is going to be exactly correct. I do see that there is a little bit of bodice curving on some extant pieces. Here, I'm not quite sure if it is this dramatic. We shall see how this all works out. And so I went ahead and I cut out my new pattern pieces out of the real fabric. This is just a white cotton. It's a little bit heavier than what I think a Regency petticoat cotton would have been made of, but because the gown in the portrait is so sheer, and I do have to put this on a 21st century model, I had to give this a little bit more opacity, otherwise we'd probably be arrested for indecent exposure, and we don't really want that. So slightly heavier cotton. If you're looking to make a historically true recreation of this gown, probably choose something a little bit lighter, I would recommend, but for the purposes of this project, it had to be a little heavier. So I have already begun stitching some of my pieces together. I'm sorry it's horribly wrinkled. I had to travel with it and was working on it while I was traveling, so I have not finished all of my seams. I've still got my side seams that have to be put here, and the other shoulder strap that has to go on, so you will get to see a little bit of footage of that, as well as the whole skirt, which I have yet to cut out, so there will be lots more information on what's happening with the skirt. So let's get on with the rest of this video, shall we? So here we are, finishing up that bit of stitching for the bodice and shoulder straps. I'm doing this with a very small, tight back stitch in waxed linen thread, although one who had their life a bit more organized than I would have thought to obtain some bleached linen thread to blend more naturally with this white garment. And of course these raw edges are finished with a bit of turning and felling. And just like that, the bodice is now together, and I've gone ahead and marked out the points to gather between at the front. But for some reason, it seems I'm ignoring that for now, and felling down the edges of the arm's eyes instead. Can you tell this video was made over the course of about a month? Bodice aside for now, I'm taking a second to cut out my skirt panels. I claim to have gotten the measurements for these from one of the gowns in Janet Arnold, although as you shall see shortly, they ended up to be a bit too narrow, and so that is probably false. In any case, I'm presently measuring the skirt width and length directly onto the fabric, as the pieces are just long rectangles that will be stitched together. There's a bit of pleating just at the back on the Met reference, which I'm going to attempt for this reproduction, so there's a bit of extra room at the upper waistband, and yet it was still a bit short. Someone please send math help. On the center back panel, I'm marking and cutting a 10-inch slit at the center point for an opening. The edge of this is then finished off with a narrow felled hem. So before I go and start to stitch these skirt panels together, I just decided to do a little bit of experimenting with these little pin tuck pleat things that I see on the original Met petticoat. I really love the idea of them. I think they add quite a nice little detail to the bottom of the skirt. However, I think my fabric is a little bit too heavy to be able to do this properly. Of course, I have to stitch them down and give them a bit of a press to really find out, but I'm just not entirely convinced that this will behave quite in the same way as this nice, light, delicate muslin here. However, I think I'm going to go ahead and just stitch them in and press them down and see what happens. I may just keep them in just because it is a nice little technique that I think I want to put into practice and will be something nice to demonstrate in case you are following along with your own Regency petticoat in a more period correct fabric than this. So I haven't yet pleated up the front panel, and I will go ahead and show you how I did this on that. Also, I should note that this petticoat actually has quite a number of pleats at the hem. I only have got 3 plus the hem in here only because I, of course, miscalculated my my length measurement and only added enough length to do these couple of pleats here, but that's okay. I'll still have the nice little pleated effect, just with a little bit fewer pleats, but I'll still have the length, which I think is probably more important than having more pleats. The original hem is finished with a 1-inch fold to match the 1-inch lower pin tucks, and so I'm just marking a 1/4 of an inch to fold up before marking and folding the full 1-inch hem into place. It's a bit difficult to see the pencil lines here, but I've marked a line 2 inches above the pinned line at the hem, and then another 2 inches above that. The idea is that the two pencil lines will be joined together, like so that the 2-inch space between is folded in half to form 1-inch pleats. This admittedly took me much longer to work out than it should have done, but I was ever so certain I'd finally worked it out here. Spoiler alert, I hadn't. I repeated this process again for the second row, and with the third, only the upper tuck is taken a bit wider at 1.5 inches wide, since that's what was present on the Met reference, and I just thought I'd go with it. The pleats are then secured into place with a running back stitch, since these seams are purely decorative and won't be strained, so the speed of a running stitch can be favored over the strength of a full back stitch. And finally, they are given a good press to set them neatly into place. Then, with the right sides together, the skirt panels can be pinned together and stitched. Once again, I'm just using a running back stitch since skirt seams generally aren't strained and can again provide a bit of time saving. And of course, these seams are finished with a bit of felling, folding the seam allowances over to the back panel so that the stitches don't come through on the front. So I have finished my little pin tuck endeavor. Pardon the extreme wrinkliness of this petticoat. It's been bunched up in my hands for the past couple of hours, but unfortunately I've come to the realization that I am apparently completely incompetent at math and entirely mismeasured the amount of length that I would need to add for these pin tucks in order for the hem still to reach the floor. You can see I'm still very, very far away. See, I forgot that in pleats you actually have to add 1 width for the front and then 1 width for the back, and then the extra length here. Apparently logic isn't my thing at present, so I shall be taking out these 3 pin tucks. I think I'm going to go ahead and leave the 1-inch hem if I can. I may let it down if needs still be, but just releasing these 3 should solve the problem, I hope. In any case, it was fun to do, and I hope maybe you learned something about pin tucks, and that hopefully you won't make my same very, very foolish mistakes. So to distract myself from this pin tuck existential crisis, I decided to go ahead and proceed with the bodice instead. I'm going to gather up the front bit so that I can attach the waistband, so I'm first running a gathering thread along the bottom edge. This is basically just a long running stitch, or basting stitch, sitting just below the seam allowance line so that it doesn't sit on the actual garment. I'm then marking out the measurement of the final gathered length onto my waistband, which I determined when fitting the mock-up. My bodice should want to gather down to 14.5 inches, and so I'm marking out this length with the center front point of the waistband sitting at the middle. Then I'm fixing both endpoints and the center front to their respective points on the bodice so that I could gather down each half accordingly. By the way, the gathering thread is also linen. It just wasn't waxed so that it would slide more easily along the fabric. The waistband is then attached with a back stitch. Now, in order to address the fullness at the neckline edge, I'm going to put in a little drawstring to gather it together. I'm planning to do this by folding and basting down a tiny 1/8 of an inch at the edge, then folding it down again to encase the drawstring tape. The tape is just a bit of narrow 3/8 of an inch woven cotton tape, which will be stitched down at the base of the neck edge on either side and tied together at the middle. Without having actually examined an original, I can't say for certain that this would have been the construction method used. However, the drawstring neck edge itself is evident on both of my reference pictures, with the MFA Boston one I'm consulting for the bodice tying at the center front. The folded casing is then quickly felt into place. Then I can go ahead and finish off the rest of the neckline that isn't involved in the casing, so the shoulder straps and up and around to the back of the bodice. Once again, this edge is just narrowly rolled under and then felled into place. So my sister is in town this weekend, so we've just had a fitting with this little petticoat friend. It went much better than I thought it would. There actually aren't as many problems with the back shapes as I thought there would. I just had to take a little bit out of the side seams. The back of it works just fine. The length of it actually works really well. I thought it would be slightly too long, but it actually works really, really well and looks very similar to the Met petticoat example, which is very good. I also had to take a little bit out of the shoulders straps, but that's no issue. The only major alteration, which I sort of think I knew was coming, was that the skirt is indeed very, very slim, and that it is not quite a hobble skirt, but it is borderline there, and I'm not sure that that is entirely historically correct. So I will be inserting some gores into the side seams of the skirt, which of course I have not seen on extant garments, but it is of course a technique that's been used on shifts to give a little bit more width into the skirt areas, and so it's not a historically incorrect manner of widening a skirt if you needed to do so. I'm sure historically they would have cut their skirts correctly to begin with, only because they probably have a little bit more experience in making petticoats than I do, but in the spirit of experimentation, that is how I think I'm going to solve this issue. So I shall get off to doing these little alterations, and I shall chat with you in a bit. So alterations are now complete. I have now got gores in the side panels of the skirt, and it is much more functional and logical now. We're going to pretend as if 2 weeks haven't elapsed since that last clip, and we're just going to go ahead and proceed with finishing this little petticoat. All I really have to do is just cut some facings for this back panel so that I can put the buttonholes and the buttons on, and then I've just got to pleat up this back panel to fit onto the waistband, put in the drawstring, and then just finish up this waistband. So onward. I'm drawing out the facing pieces now, which are just the length of the back bodice panel, and then 1 inch wide since I have 1/2 inch buttons that I will be using. This layer will serve 2 purposes. First, to provide an extra layer of strength to the fabric where the buttons will be pulling a bit, and it will also finish off my center back edges. The facing pieces themselves are cut with an additional 1/4 inch seam allowance. I used some commuting time wisely and got the top and inner edges of the facing panels hemmed, so now I'm just attaching the opposite raw edges of the panels to the center back panels of the bodice with a small back stitch. This might not be necessary, but I've just stitched the top edge of the panel to the bodice layer so that they don't try and peek out. And with a nice press at the edges, I'm now ready to add in the buttons. In retrospect, I would probably have added a 1/2 inch more width to the button side of the bodice so that the 2 panels sit symmetrically when closed, but oh well, next time. Now I'm going to mark out the placement for my buttonholes. The reference example features 2 buttons, one at the top and the other around center, level with the bottom of the arm size. So this is what I'm going to attempt for my reproduction. Somehow I guess I managed to convince myself that these iridescent-y plastic buttons were similar enough to the nice 4-hole shell buttons used on my reference. Present me definitely does not agree. I want the buttonholes to sit 1/8 of an inch in from the outer edge, so I'm marking this and, using the button, marking how wide to cut the slit. That done, I'm then clipping the fabric along this line and then binding it off with a buttonhole stitch in white silk thread. Since these stitches were on the outside of the garment and were often seen, nicer and more expensive silk thread was frequently employed for buttonhole stitching. Then, using the buttonholes, I'm marking out the placement for the buttons and stitching them on. I'm stitching them on a bit close to the edge, in some vain effort to have the panels not overlap so much. So now I have to finish attaching the skirt to the waistband, which I left unstitched for the fitting in case the length of the waistband needed to be adjusted. But now that that's all settled, I can go ahead and pleat up the remaining length of the skirt. This, I think, is where I went wrong with the widths. The Met example features 6 1-inch pleats on each side at the back, and I was only able to get in 5 1/2-inch pleats. I imagine all of that extra width I'm missing would have made the skirt much more comfortable to begin with. This is once again secured into place with a backstitch. And last but not least, it's time to finish off the waistband. I've cut a second length of waistband and pressed in the outer edges so that this can sit over top of all of those mangy innards and finish up the inside neatly. But first, since the Met example also secures at the waist point with a bit of drawstring, I'll be inserting another length of cotton tape between these layers. I'm just trimming up some of these excess edges real quick, then laying down my tape and pinning the waistband on top, starting at the center front and working my way out. When I get to the end, I'm just making sure that both outer and inner layers of the waistband are folded inward to protect those raw edges. Both edges are felled down, and I'm making sure to catch the seam allowance area of the outer layer so that my felling stitches don't show through to the front of the garment. Once again, I must disclaim that the method I'm using here is strictly my interpretation of how I think the features on the garments in the photographs were originally constructed. However, as I've not seen the extant objects, I can't be entirely certain. And with that finished, the petticoat layer is complete. I feel like this process was mainly an extraordinary learning process in the cut and shaping of Regency garments. It is so far from perfect, and part of me is already looking at this as a mock-up attempt and is ready to start on the new and improved petticoat right away. But therein, I suppose, is the point of these dress diaries, to document the process so that I can recognize what can be done better when that next time does come around. And hopefully you can too. Anyway, I'm glad I've gotten this little bit of experience before proceeding on to the main gown, which I'll be working on throughout the coming month. In the meanwhile, do stick around for some smaller projects and some costumey chats if you like, and perhaps I shall see you soon for some more historical sewing adventures.